The dimly lit backroom of Harper's Tavern reeked of desperation and spilled whiskey. Harold Grayson, a 72-year-old retiree with shaking hands and a weathered face, pushed his pension, his entire life savings, into the pot. The poker game was his last chance to reclaim dignity from a lifetime of regrets. The cards hit the table. His hand was a losing one. That night, Harold didn't just lose money. He lost his home, his family's trust, and any shred of hope he had left. The scent of coffee filled Harold Grayson's kitchen as sunlight crept through the lace curtains. The house was quiet, as it had been for years since Margaret, his wife of 45 years, passed away. At 72, Harold's life felt empty, routine anchoring him to days that stretched endlessly. A retired mechanic, he had worked tirelessly for decades, but now the hours felt hollow, unyielding. His son, Jake, lived nearby but rarely visited. Their relationship, long strained by Harold's absence during Jake's childhood, felt irreparable. Harold tried to fill the void with hobbies, gardening, puzzles, painting, but none held his interest. He spent his days with only the ghosts of memory for company. It was by chance that Harold found poker one night at the community center. A group of locals gathered around a table, the stakes small, the atmosphere light-hearted. Harold hesitated but sat down, drawn to the game. The cards, the strategy, the subtle tension, it awakened something in him. For the first time in years, Harold felt alive. The weekly games became his sanctuary. It wasn't about money, it was about the camaraderie and the thrill. The men at the table became a surrogate family. But as the months passed, Harold found himself wanting more. The low-stakes games weren't enough. The thrill was fading. One evening, Harold ventured into Harper's Tavern, a bar infamous for its high-stakes poker games. The players were a different breed, sharp-eyed, ruthless, and unyielding. Harold was hesitant but intrigued. He began to play, winning small amounts at first. The rush was electric, and he felt reborn. But the wins dwindled, and Harold began dipping into his savings. Just one more hand, he'd tell himself, convinced the next game would turn it all around. The losses stung, but the hope of redemption kept him returning. Margaret's voice often echoed in his mind. "Be careful, Harold." But the desperation to feel alive again drowned out her caution. One night, after a devastating loss, Harold sat at the bar nursing a whiskey. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette. The bartender, Sam, shook his head. "You're playing with fire," Sam muttered. Harold stared at his glass. "What else is there?" he whispered. That night, desperation overtook reason. Harold withdrew his entire pension, convincing himself it was for Jake and his grandchildren, to leave them a legacy. But deep down, he knew it was for himself, for one last chance to prove he still mattered. The next night, Harold entered Harper's Tavern with a heavy heart and a single goal. The other players sensed his desperation, but Harold didn't care. As he shuffled the cards, he thought of Jake, of Margaret, of the life he'd lived. He knew the odds were against him, but for once he dared to hope. With trembling hands, Harold placed his bet, setting in motion a chain of events that would alter his life forever. The air in Harper's Tavern was thick with tension. Smoke curled in lazy spirals under dim lights, and the faint hum of conversation was drowned by the clinking of glasses. Harold Grayson sat at the poker table, his hands trembling as they gripped his cards. In front of him sat his entire pension, the sum of a lifetime's hard work, stacked neatly in chips. He was gambling it all, and he knew it. Around the table sat the other players. Vince, with his intimidating size and permanent sneer, exuded confidence. Lisa, calculating and cold, gave nothing away in her expression. Raoul, the wild card, tapped his fingers impatiently, his unpredictability a weapon of its own. Harold felt their eyes on him, sizing him up. They smelled his desperation, and it made him vulnerable. The first few hands weren't kind. Harold folded more than he played, watching his stack diminish as Vince smirked and Raoul taunted him with aggressive raises. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on his chest. This wasn't like the friendly games at the community center. This was a battleground. Then came a glimmer of hope, a pair of aces. Harold's pulse quickened as he placed a cautious bet. Vince raised immediately, leaning forward with that familiar sneer. Lisa and Raoul followed. Harold hesitated, then pushed in more chips. "Call?" he said, trying to steady his voice. The next card did nothing for Harold's hand, but the pot grew as the players upped the stakes. Vince's confidence seemed unshakable. Lisa's silence unnerved him, and Raoul, for once, seemed uncertain. Harold took a deep breath and pushed the rest of his stack forward. "All in," he declared. The table fell silent. Vince laughed harshly, shoving his chips in without hesitation. Lisa folded, her expression unreadable. Raoul muttered a curse before throwing down his cards. It was down to Harold and Vince. The final card was dealt. Harold's heart sank. Vince laid down his hand, a straight. Harold's pair of aces was worthless. The table erupted in murmurs as Vince raked in the pot, his laughter echoing in Harold's ears. Harold sat frozen, his mind reeling. It was over. He had lost everything. His pension, his security, his last shred of hope. He barely noticed the other players gathering their chips or the bartender offering him a drink on the house. He was too consumed by the weight of his failure. Stumbling out of the tavern, Harold was greeted by the biting cold of the night. The streets were empty, the silence amplifying his despair. He wandered aimlessly, his thoughts a whirlwind of regret and self-recrimination. How had it come to this? How could he face Jake, his son, after gambling away his future? But as Harold walked, something shifted within him. The enormity of his loss was undeniable, but so was his resolve. He had hit rock bottom, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He had nothing left to lose, and in that he found a strange sense of freedom. Harold Grayson had gambled everything and lost, but he still had the will to fight. And fight he would, no matter what it took to claw his way back. Harold sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the cracked wallpaper. Sunlight crept through the curtains, but it didn't ease the crushing weight in his chest. His pension, everything he had worked for, was gone. The realization hit him in waves. Rent was due in a week, utilities would follow, and there was no money to cover any of it. He had gambled it all away. The phone on his nightstand buzzed. Harold didn't need to look to know it was Jake. His son had been trying to reach him since last night. Harold ignored it, the shame too great to face. But the buzzing didn't stop, and he finally picked up. "Dad!" Jake's voice was sharp with concern. "Where were you? I've been calling. Is everything all right?" Harold hesitated. "I'm fine, Jake. Just had a rough night," he lied. "You don't sound fine. Is it the gambling again?" The words stung. Jake had warned him countless times, begged him to stop, but Harold had brushed it off. Now the truth hung over him like a dark cloud. "I said I'm fine," Harold snapped, harsher than he meant. "I just need some time." Jake sighed. "All right, Dad, but if you need help, you need to tell me. Don't go through this alone." The compassion in Jake's voice felt like a lifeline, but Harold couldn't take it. He ended the call quickly, unable to bear the weight of his son's concern. The day passed in a haze. Harold wandered the house aimlessly, every corner a reminder of Margaret. Her voice echoed in his mind, firm but loving. "Don't lose yourself, Harold." He clenched his fists, the guilt and grief intertwining until they were indistinguishable. By evening, the suffocating quiet became too much. Harold grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The cold air bit at his skin as he wandered aimlessly through the streets. Every shadow seemed to whisper his failure. Eventually, he stopped outside Jake's house. Through the window, he saw his grandchildren laughing and playing. Their joy was a sharp contrast to his despair. For a fleeting moment, he considered knocking, confessing everything and asking for help. But the thought of Jake's disappointment stopped him. Harold turned and walked away, Hours later, he found himself standing outside Harper's Tavern. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow on the pavement. He stared at the door, temptation tugging at him. It would be so easy to go inside, to drown his sorrows in whiskey and pretend the night hadn't happened. But something inside him shifted. He had lost everything in that place. Going back wouldn't change that. Harold turned and walked home instead. His steps were heavy, but they carried a glimmer of resolve. He didn't know how to fix his life, but he knew one thing: he couldn't keep running. As Harold stepped into his house, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the first step forward. He had hit rock bottom, but he was still standing. And, for now, that was enough. "There's been a mistake," Harold stammered. "I don't owe Vince anything." The shorter man stepped forward, his tone icy. "You borrowed money to keep playing. Vince extended credit. Now he expects repayment, with interest." The memory came flooding back. Harold had been so desperate that night, so certain he could win it all back, that he'd agreed to Vince's offer without thinking of the consequences. "I don't have that kind of money," Harold whispered. The taller man smirked. "Unfortunate. Vince isn't patient. You have 1 week to pay. If you don't—" He trailed off, his meaning clear. "What happens if I can't?" Harold asked, dread pooling in his stomach. The shorter man's expression darkened. "Let's just say it won't end well. We'll be in touch." With that, they left, the weight of their threat hanging heavy in the air. Harold sank into his armchair, the debt notice crumpled in his hands. Losing his pension had been devastating, but this was worse. Now, he wasn't just broke, he was in danger. For hours, Harold wandered his small house, the walls seeming to close in on him. His thoughts churned with desperation. He had no savings, no assets, and no one to turn to. Asking Jake for help crossed his mind, but the shame of involving his son in this mess was unbearable. By evening, Harold found himself back at the kitchen table, the debt notice spread out in front of him. Every number on the page felt like a blow, a reminder of how far he'd fallen. Margaret's voice echoed in his mind, her gentle tone reminding him of the man he used to be. "You've always been a fighter, Harold. Don't give up now." The memory stung, but it also stirred something within him. Harold had spent his entire life playing by the rules, doing what was expected of him. Now, with nothing left to lose, he realized those rules had gotten him nowhere. If Vince wanted his pound of flesh, he'd have to fight for it. As the hours dragged on, Harold's despair turned into determination. He didn't know how he'd come up with the money, but he wouldn't let Vince, or anyone else, strip him of his dignity. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Harold sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He had hit rock bottom, but if there was one thing he still had, it was his will to survive. Tomorrow, he would start finding a way out. No matter what it took, Harold Grayson was going to fight back. The morning after Vince's men left, Harold stepped into the cold with one goal: buy time. He didn't know how he'd gather the money, but waiting wasn't an option. His first stop was Harper's Tavern, not to gamble, but to find someone who understood Vince's world. The bar was nearly empty, sunlight barely cutting through the dusty windows. Sam, the bartender, gave Harold a skeptical glance. "You've got guts showing up here again," he muttered. "I need information," Harold replied. Sam stared for a moment, then jerked his head toward the back. "Talk to Lisa." Harold hesitated. Lisa had been at Vince's table the night everything fell apart, a sharp player with a calculating presence. She had barely spoken, but Harold remembered her piercing gaze. If anyone could help him, it was her. He approached cautiously. She sat alone, a nearly empty beer in front of her. "Lisa," Harold said, "can I sit?" She looked up, raising an eyebrow. "You've got 5 minutes." Harold explained everything: his debt, the threats, and his desperation. When he finished, Lisa leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Vince doesn't forgive," she said bluntly. "If you owe him, he'll collect." "I don't have the money," Harold admitted, his voice cracking. "What can I do?" Lisa tapped her fingers on the table. "If you want time, make yourself useful. Vince doesn't just run poker games, he's into underground operations. High-stakes games, bigger money, fewer rules. He always needs people to keep things running." "You mean work for him?" Harold asked, dread creeping into his voice. Lisa nodded. "It's risky, but it's your only shot. If you can prove you're valuable, Vince might give you breathing room. Just don't screw it up. He doesn't tolerate mistakes." Harold's stomach churned. The thought of working for Vince felt like stepping into a trap. "How do I approach him?" Lisa smirked faintly. "You don't. He'll find you. Just make sure you're ready when he does." With that, she stood and walked away, leaving Harold alone. Her words echoed in his mind as he made his way home. The idea of working for Vince made his skin crawl, but he had no other options. True to Lisa's prediction, Vince's men came knocking that evening. Harold opened the door, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "I don't have your money," he said, meeting their gaze, "but I can work for it." The taller man raised an eyebrow. "You think Vince needs your help?" "I know the game," Harold replied. "I've been around poker tables longer than most of your players have been alive. If Vince has bigger games, I can make myself useful." The shorter man exchanged a glance with his partner, then nodded. "We'll let Vince know. Don't leave town." When they left, Harold collapsed into his chair, his hands trembling. He had just volunteered to dive deeper into the world that had already ruined him. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. If he could earn Vince's trust, maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way out. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Harold Grayson wasn't done fighting yet. 2 days after Harold offered to work for Vince, a black car pulled up outside his house. Harold's stomach churned as 2 of Vince's men stepped out. They didn't knock. One motioned for Harold to follow. His heart pounding, Harold grabbed his coat and climbed into the back seat. The ride was silent, the tension suffocating. Harold stared out the window, his mind racing. When the car finally stopped, they were in front of a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. One of the men opened the door and gestured. "Inside," he said curtly. Harold followed them into a dimly lit room. Vince was waiting, seated in a leather chair, a cigar balanced between his fingers. His sharp eyes scanned Harold and a smirk tugged at his lips. "You're either brave or stupid," Vince said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Probably both." "I need time," Harold said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I can work for you." Vince chuckled, his laugh cold and calculating. "Gutsy. But guts don't mean much here. Why should I trust you?" "I know poker," Harold replied. "I've spent my life at tables. I know how players think, how to spot cheats." Vince leaned forward, his smirk fading. "This isn't just poker, Harold. This is about power, control. You think you can handle my world?" Harold swallowed hard. "I don't have a choice." For a long moment, Vince studied him in silence. Then he nodded to one of his men. "Take him to the club. Let's see what he's made of." The club was hidden beneath a warehouse, a sprawling underground casino humming with activity. Smoke lingered in the air, and the tension was palpable. Harold's job was simple. Watch the players, spot cheats, and report anything suspicious. But Vince's world was far darker than Harold had imagined. These weren't casual players. They were high rollers, people with everything to lose and dangerous tempers. Harold watched as fortunes changed hands in minutes. Tempers flared, and the faintest hint of cheating led to explosive confrontations. By the end of his first night, Harold was exhausted. Vince's men drove him home and he collapsed onto his bed, his mind swirling with what he'd seen. He was in over his head, but at least he was moving forward. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next day, Harold returned to the club. The work was relentless, the hours long, but he kept his head down and did what was asked of him. Slowly, he began to understand the unspoken rules of Vince's world. He learned who to avoid, how to navigate the tension, and how to stay invisible when necessary. Gradually, he earned a sliver of respect from Vince's men, enough to keep him in their good graces. Late one night, after a particularly tense shift, Harold sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the debt notice pinned to his fridge. The numbers seemed insurmountable, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't free yet, not by a long shot, but he was fighting, and for now, that was enough. The underground casino buzzed with activity as Harold walked in for another shift. 4 weeks into the job, he was starting to notice patterns, the regulars, the rhythms of the night, and the tension that never quite disappeared. But tonight, something felt different. Vince's top enforcer, Dominic, stood near the entrance scanning the room. Dominic wasn't a regular presence at the club, and Harold knew his arrival meant trouble. Harold kept his head down and took his usual place by the surveillance station. The night started quietly, but Harold couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. Players whispered more than usual, their eyes darting nervously. Even the dealers seemed uneasy. Harold's instincts told him to stay alert. At one of the high-stakes tables, a man dressed too casually for the crowd was making bold bets and winning big. His confidence seemed out of place, almost rehearsed. Harold leaned closer to the monitor, watching the man's movements. He didn't spot anything obvious, but the man's behavior set off alarms. The man made another outrageous bet and won, drawing uneasy glances from the other players. One of them signaled to Dominic, who crossed the floor and loomed over the man. "We need to talk," Dominic said, his voice low. The man smirked. "Lead the way." Harold watched as Dominic escorted the man to a back room. His curiosity burned, but he knew better than to follow. He returned to his station, trying to focus on the monitors. An hour later, Dominic appeared at his side. "You," Dominic said, "come with me." Harold froze. His pulse quickened as he followed Dominic down a narrow hallway. In the back room, the man from the table sat, his earlier bravado replaced by unease. Vince sat across from him, his expression cold. "Harold," Vince said, motioning to a chair. "Sit." Harold obeyed, his hands gripping the chair's edge, Vince's sharp gaze fixed on him. "This man says he wasn't cheating. I trust your judgment. What do you think?" Harold's mind raced. He had seen enough to suspect the man, but calling him out in front of Vince was risky. Taking a deep breath, he said, "His moves felt off. Too rehearsed. I'd look into it." Vince nodded, his expression unreadable. He turned to the man. "You hear that? My guy doesn't trust you. Care to explain?" The man's composure cracked. "I didn't cheat. I just got lucky." "Lucky doesn't feel rehearsed," Vince said icily. He nodded to Dominic. "Take him out back. Make sure he learns the rules." Harold's stomach churned as Dominic dragged the man away. Vince turned back to Harold. "Good instincts. Don't waste them." Harold nodded but felt sick. He had just played a role in someone's fate, and it left a sour taste. As he returned to his post, the weight of the night pressed down on him. For the first time, Harold questioned whether he could keep going. The danger, the moral compromises, the constant tension, it was suffocating. But he reminded himself why he was here. To survive, to fix the life he had broken. He wasn't doing this for Vince. He was doing it for himself. Harold straightened in his chair, his resolve hardening. He had made it this far. He wasn't about to quit now. Harold's routine at the underground casino had become almost mechanical. Watch the monitors, report suspicious activity, and keep his head down. But tonight, something shattered the monotony. At a high-stakes table, Harold noticed a man he recognized. Victor, an old acquaintance from his community center poker days. Victor had always been a cautious player, but here, In Vince's world, he looked completely out of place. Victor's nervous energy was evident. His hands trembled as he handled his chips and his bets were erratic. Harold's chest tightened. Victor wasn't just out of place. He was in trouble. By midnight, Victor was losing steadily. Harold could see the desperation in his eyes as he leaned forward, chasing losses he couldn't afford. The pit in Harold's stomach grew when Victor borrowed chips from Vince's dealer. Harold had seen it before. Taking Vince's money meant entering a debt with no escape. The game ended, and Victor sat slumped in his chair. Dominic approached him, speaking quietly, but Harold didn't need to hear the words. Victor owed Vince, and Vince always collected. For the next few days, Harold couldn't shake the image of Victor's slumped shoulders. The guilt gnawed at him. He remembered Victor as the quiet man from the community center poker games, someone who brought coffee for the group and always left before things got too intense. That Victor didn't belong here. But here he was, desperate and broken. Harold told himself there was nothing he could do. Helping Victor would put him in Vince's crosshairs, and Harold was barely keeping his own head above water. But the thought of doing nothing was unbearable. The nagging voice in his head wouldn't let him rest. One evening, after his shift, Harold made a decision. He found Victor at a rundown diner near the edge of town and slid into the booth across from him. Victor looked up, his face pale, his hands trembling as he clutched a coffee cup. "Harold," Victor said, his voice hollow, "what are you doing here?" "I should be asking you the same thing," Harold replied. "What are you doing in Vince's club?" Victor's shoulders slumped further. "I didn't have a choice. I needed the money." "And now you owe Vince," Harold said, his tone firm. "Do you have a plan to pay him back?" Victor didn't answer. The silence was enough. Harold leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. You need to get out. Vince doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget." Victor shook his head, laughing bitterly. "And go where? Do what? I'm finished, Harold." "No, you're not," Harold said. "But if you stay, you will be." Victor looked at him, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "What do I do?" Harold hesitated. He didn't have an immediate solution, but he knew they couldn't wait. "I'll think of something," he said. "But whatever we do, it has to be soon." As Harold left the diner, his mind raced. Helping Victor would put him at risk, but he couldn't ignore the chance to do something right. Vince's world had taken so much from him already. If he could pull Victor out of Vince's grasp, maybe he could salvage a piece of himself. For the first time in weeks, Harold felt something other than guilt and fear. He felt purpose. Harold knew helping Victor was dangerous, but doing nothing wasn't an option. Days after their diner meeting, Harold pieced together a risky plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was all he had. Victor had fallen into Vince's debt, and Harold knew how these stories ended. Vince didn't just want money, he wanted control. The only way to free Victor was to make him valuable to Vince, valuable enough to buy time. Harold found Victor at the diner again. Victor looked worse than before, his hands trembling as he gripped his coffee cup. "We don't have options," Harold said, sliding into the booth. "But I've got a plan." Victor looked up, his voice shaky. "What plan?" "I'll tell Vince you can work with me at the club," Harold said. "You'll help spot cheats, keep things smooth. It buys us time." Victor's eyes widened. "You're insane. What if he figures it out?" "He won't if we handle it right," Harold replied firmly. "But if you run, he'll find you. This is the only way." Victor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "If you think it'll work, I'll try." The next night, Harold stood in Vince's office. Vince leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze boring into him. "What do you want, Harold?" "It's about Victor," Harold said. "He owes you, but I think we can avoid trouble." "Go on," Vince said. "Let me use him at the club," Harold explained. "He's sharp, good at reading people. He can help me keep the games clean and spot cheats. He works off his debt, and your operation stays smooth." Vince studied Harold in silence, then smirked. "If he screws up, Harold, it's on you. Understand?" Harold nodded. "I understand." Victor started at the club that night. Harold guided him, keeping him out of Dominic's path. Victor was jittery but improved as the nights passed. By the end of the week, he was finding his footing. Harold felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they could pull this off. But Vince's world didn't let anyone escape cleanly. Late one night, as Harold and Victor wrapped up a shift, Dominic appeared. "Vince wants to see you both," Dominic said. Harold's stomach dropped. Together, they followed Dominic to Vince's office. Vince sat behind his desk, his expression cold. "You've been busy?" he said. "Victor's doing good work," Harold replied. "He's earning back what he owes." Vince nodded. "That's what I've heard. But you're forgetting something." "What's that?" Harold asked. "Trust," Vince said. "You think I trust you? Or him? Prove your loyalty, both of you. Or this ends tonight." As Dominic escorted them out, Harold's mind raced. Vince's warning wasn't a bluff. If they didn't prove themselves, their time was up. Victor turned to Harold, fear in his eyes. "What do we do now?" Harold didn't have an answer, but one thing was clear. They were running out of time. The air was heavy as Harold and Victor left Vince's office. Vince's ultimatum hung over them like a storm cloud. Whatever move they made next would decide their fate. Victor's voice trembled. "We can't prove anything to Vince. We're done." "No," Harold said firmly. "We still have a chance. We just have to be smart." Harold spent the next day piecing together a desperate plan. Vince valued loyalty, but he valued control even more. If Harold could deliver something valuable, something that proved their worth, Vince might let them live. That's when Harold thought of Marcus, a high roller who had been under suspicion for weeks. Harold had noticed subtle tells in Marcus's behavior, signs he was cheating. If they could expose him, Vince might listen. That night, Harold pulled Victor aside before their shift. "We're going after Marcus," he said. "If we prove he's cheating, we might get out of this." Victor hesitated. "And if we're wrong?" "We're not wrong," Harold said. "I've seen the signs. We just need proof." Victor nodded reluctantly, and they went to work. The club was buzzing that night, its usual electric energy masking the tension they both felt. Harold and Victor shadowed Marcus, watching his every move. Hours passed, and Harold began to fear they'd find nothing. Then Marcus slipped. He palmed a chip, a move so subtle most would have missed it. Harold signaled to Victor, and together they collected the evidence. Harold's hands trembled as he approached Dominic with the recording. "We've got proof Marcus is cheating," he said. Dominic studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Follow me." They were escorted to Vince's office. Vince looked up as they entered, his sharp eyes narrowing. "This better be worth my time," he said. Harold handed over the recording. Vince watched in silence, his face unreadable. When the video ended, he leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk on his lips. "So, Marcus has been playing dirty. Interesting." Harold exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. Vince's smirk faded as he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold, calculated tone. "You've bought yourselves time. But don't mistake this for trust. You're still on thin ice, both of you. One slip, and we're done." Harold nodded. "We understand." As they left the office, Victor turned to Harold. "We did it," he said, relief mingling with fear. "But for how long?" Harold didn't have an answer. Vince's world was ruthless, and one victory didn't guarantee safety. But for now, they had a sliver of hope, and Harold would cling to it. That night, Harold lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought of everything he had lost, his pension, his freedom, his peace. But he also thought of what he had gained. Helping Victor had reminded him of something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose. He wasn't free yet, but he was fighting. And for the first time in a long time, Harold felt alive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. Vince's world didn't allow for mistakes, but Harold was no longer the man who had gambled everything away. He was something else now, someone who still had something to fight for, and he would keep fighting.